All right, here in verse 1 of Psalm 78, we read a contemplation. Now, as the Tanakh and several other translations will have it, they leave the Hebrew there, or at least as far as the Hebrew, how it would sound in the Hebrew. There's a maskil. This is a maskil of Asaph. Again, as we know, we're going through a number of hymns or psalms that Asaph had either was appointed by David to do or simply he did as God guided and inspired him under David's authority. Now, this psalm is a review of many of the failures of God's people and God's nation to remain faithful to God, and it also records the repercussions they experienced because of those failures. And those failures began when they were drawn out of Egypt, and those failures continued until the beginning of David's reign. Now, that's all we're given in this psalm. Obviously, things went on after David's reign, but that was done later on. This particular psalm only goes up to the time of David, again, as it was composed by Asaph. This psalm serves as a reminder. Remember, the third book of the Psalms is about the time of tribulation and events and individuals that are tied to the end-time events. And, of course, the Church of God obviously is tied into end-time events. And so this particular psalm serves as a reminder and a warning for all of God's people to avoid following the path that ancient Israel took in their disloyalty to God. And again, this particular passage here, because it's in the third book of the Psalms, this particular psalm is especially true for those who are under the terms of the new covenant, as the Apostle Paul brings out back in 1 Corinthians. Hold your place in Psalm 78, but in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, the Apostle Paul addresses pretty much what this psalm is about, which is about what happened to ancient Israel. I won't start up in verse 1, but just go to verse 11, which is a summary of the various things that Paul brings out here. He says, "Now all these things happened to them." A lot of death, a lot of dying in the wilderness because of ignoring the rock that was with them. These things happened to them as examples. That is, God made certain that all of these things, these experiences of ancient Israel, were recorded as examples. And they were written for our admonition, or as the Revised English Bible has, as a warning for us. The us here, Paul writing, is the church. It's a warning for us. We need to pay close attention to what happened to ancient Israel. For us, upon whom the ends of the ages have come. All right, so he's talking about the church at the close of the age. And again, this is especially true for the elect at the close of the age, the time of, as we know from Revelation chapter 3, the time of Laodicea, a time when God has some very dire pronouncements about his elect at the close of the age. All right, let's move on here in Psalm 78. Contemplation of Asaph. "Give ear, O my people, to my law," or my teaching, which is better, because this is a teaching. This is the Torah, as the Hebrew would have. "Give ear to my teaching. Incline your ears," or listen, "to the words of my mouth. I will open my mouth in a parable," or Tanakh says, "I will expound a theme. I will utter dark sayings of old," or as the Tanakh says, "I will utter lessons of the past." Things that happened in the past as lessons for us, just like what Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 10. He goes on in verse 3, "which we have heard," these lessons of the past, "which we have heard and known." We're well aware of them. We've heard them our entire lives, Asaph is saying, which was true back in that time. "And our fathers," or ancestors, "have told us," which we have heard and known, and our fathers, or our ancestors, have told us. This has been passed down. "We will not hide them." That is, we will not hide these teachings, the teachings of these examples that are given. We will not hide them from their children, telling to the generation to come the praises of the Eternal and His strength and His wonderful works that He has done. For He established a testimony in Jacob and appointed a law, a Torah, a teaching, as some translations have, a teaching in Israel. So He gave a testimony and He gave a teaching. Now the words God spoke in the hearing of all of the descendants of Jacob as a testimony directly from Him were the 10 Commandments. That's the testimony. It's what He said. He stated with His own voice, and they heard. So He gave the testimony of the 10 Commandments. The 10 Commandments obviously define the conduct that God requires of all those who enter into covenant with Him as their God. You want me to be your God? You must align yourself with these commandments. You must obey these commandments. Now the law, or the Torah, that he mentions here, established a testimony, the 10 Commandments, appointed a law or a Torah, a teaching. That referred to all of the instructions or all of the teachings that God gave Israel concerning how to fulfill the commandments and to properly worship Him. There's a way that He can be worshiped, and one way, and that's the only way, and you can't add to or subtract from, as the closing verses of Deuteronomy chapter 12 brings out. You can't add to, you can't take away. You do it exactly the way. And so He gave them that information. Back in Exodus chapter 31, Exodus 31, just as proof that the testimony he's referring to here are the commandments. Exodus 31, verse 18. It says, "And when He made an end of speaking with him," that is with Moses, on Mount Sinai, He, God, gave Moses 2 tablets of the testimony. And those 2 tablets contain what? The 10 Commandments. That's the testimony. Tablets of stone written with the finger of God. All right, so that's the testimony. We go back to Psalm 78, verse 5. "For He established a testimony in Jacob and appointed a law in Israel, which He commanded our fathers, that they should make them," the testimony and the teaching about the testimony, "known to their children, that the generation to come might know them, the children who would be born, that they may arise and declare them to their children." God made it extremely clear here that each generation was responsible for continually teaching and reminding each successive generation about the importance of maintaining their unique relationship with God, which required them to be faithful at all times to His testimony and His law, or His teaching. In Deuteronomy again, let's go back to Deuteronomy. I referred to it, but let's go to chapter 6. Deuteronomy chapter 6. And pick it up here in verse 5. Deuteronomy 6, verse 5. Here he says, "You shall love the Eternal your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength. And these words which I command you today shall be in your heart." No, shall be in your heart. Everything that I'm telling you shall be in your heart. What he's talking about here is they need to be internalized. They need to be internal. In your heart doesn't mean some fluttery feeling. It means they need to be internalized, filling your thoughts. This is what God expected of Israel. If you want me as your God, this is what you got to do. Everything, all these words I command you today shall be in your heart. You shall teach them diligently, not haphazardly, not occasionally, diligently to your children, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, when you walk by the way, when you lie down, and when you rise up. This is from morning to evening. In everything that you do, you need to always keep in mind what's most important, your relationship with God. Now, back in Psalm, hold your place there. We're going to come back, but back in Psalm 78, verse 7, All right, so he commanded, verses 5 and 6, you commanded our fathers, they make these known to their children, generation after generation, that, verse 7, that they may set their hope, or set their confidence, either way, hope or confidence, different translations have, in God, that they may set their hope in God, and not forget the works of God, but keep His commandments. Only by constant repetition would it be possible for them to always remember and never forget God and all that He had done for them. Repetition, repetition, repetition. Again, back in Deuteronomy 6, and let's pick it up in verse 8. We left off in verse 7. Here in verse 8, I'll read from the New Living Translation. God tells them through Moses, tie them to your hands and wear them on your forehead as reminders. That is, the testimony and the teaching. Write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. They need to be everywhere so that you just can't fail to see them. The eternal your God will soon bring you into the land He swore to give you when He made a vow to your ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It is a land with large, prosperous cities that you did not build. The houses will be richly stocked with goods you did not produce. You will draw water from cisterns you did not dig, and you will eat from vineyards and olive trees you did not plant. When you have eaten your fill in this land, be careful. Careful for what? Not to forget the eternal. Once things are going very well and you're prospering and things are just, you don't have too many worries, you've got all kinds of food and everything, be careful not to forget the eternal who rescued you from slavery in the land of Egypt. Don't forget Him. Got to repeat it over and over. The need for repetition is just as critical for spiritual Israel as it was for physical Israel, carnal Israel. This is made very, very clear in the prayer outline that Christ gave His disciples to use on a daily basis. Use this outline, not to repeat the prayer outline, but use this as the outline for your prayer. Each day, the disciples of Christ, the elect, are to focus on the Father, to focus on His kingdom, on doing His will, requesting spiritual nourishment, asking for forgiveness for spiritual shortcomings and His help, God's help to remain faithful to Him throughout the day, and also acknowledging that His way and the gift that He has promised surpasses everything that this world has to offer. Yours is the power and the kingdom and the glory forever. Okay? That's what we are to be mindful of. We are to repeat, repetition. How often do we go through this outline? Daily, because we must ask for our daily bread. So God expects us to repeat it, just like He told ancient Israel, you've got to repeat it. You need to put it here and there. We need to do it in our prayer. All right. So again, back in Psalm 78, verse 7 again, that they may set their hope in God and not forget the works of God, but keep His commandments, and may not, verse 8, may not be like their fathers. They can't be like they were. A stubborn and rebellious generation, a generation that did not set its heart aright, and whose spirit was not faithful to God. Now, this refers to the generation that God had brought out of Egypt and who died during the 40 years wandering because they refused to obey God and take possession of the promised land. When they refused to go up and take it, He said, fine, for 40 years, you're going to be out here in this desert. And we'll pick up more on that a little bit later on here in the psalm. In verse 9, Moffat translates this more clearly, I believe, than any of the others. The Ephraimites were like a disappointing bow that fails upon the day of battle. Or, we could say a disappointing gun that, jams in the day of battle. The weapon is of no value. It cannot be trusted. Well, the Ephraimites were that way. They couldn't be trusted. Now, even though the term Ephraimites, at a later period in history, because remember, this was written by the time of David. This was before the northern and southern kingdoms and everything that went on later on, where the northern kingdom was considered Ephraim, because Ephraim was the most powerful tribe. So it could be, the term Ephraimites later on, could be applied to the northern kingdom of Israel. Again, you go back to Ezekiel 37 and throughout the book of Hosea and several other places, Ephraim is equal to the northern kingdom of Israel. In this instance, however, based on the closing verses of this psalm, Ephraimites seems to refer to all of the tribes of Israel that were led into the promised land by Joshua. Joshua, remember, was of the tribe of Ephraim. And Ephraim was considered to be the chief tribe because Jacob, remember, laid his right hand on Ephraim and his left hand on Manasseh. Ephraim being the younger. Manasseh was the firstborn, Ephraim was secondborn. But the right hand went on it, and that's where, again, the birthright blessings went to him and to Manasseh as well. They both received them, but Ephraim would receive his first, and Manasseh would receive his later. And again, once they entered in and the land was divided, it was in the territory of Ephraim, in Shiloh, or Shiloh as we like to call it, where the Ark of the Tabernacle, the Tabernacle and the Ark of the Covenant were kept in the land of Ephraim. So the Ephraimites, I think, is a reference basically to the tribes of Israel under Joshua. That fits with what goes on here. All right, so going on in verse 10. They, the Ephraimites, did not keep the covenant of God. They refused to walk in his law or simply obey. They refused to obey his law, according to the New English Translation, and forgot his works and his wonders that he had shown them. Once Joshua and the elders that outlived him died, all of the tribes of Israel forsook God, and they forsook the covenant that had established him as their God. They forgot the major miracles he had done when they entered into the promised land and after, such as all of the waters of the Jordan River stopping like with an invisible wall. They stopped and built up behind that dam, and the waters went back to the north. And all of those waters were removed, and the riverbed was dry, and Israel marched across dry shod. That was an incredible miracle. Just like leaving Egyptian territory through the Red Sea, they walked dry shod. And so when they enter the Promised Land, same thing. And then, of course, there were right after that the walls of Jericho. That was another miracle they witnessed. It fell flat at the blast of the trumpets when all of the people shouted, remember? And all the walls just came falling down. They didn't fall outward like an earthquake. They just crumbled into piles. That's the way it happened, which was a unique way for something to take place. And then, of course, there was the time when the sun and the moon were not moving, when God killed the majority of the Amorites by using large hailstones, something that's going to be repeated in the seventh bowl plague. And so these Israelites, either they or their parents, maybe their grandparents sometimes, they had witnessed these things. And there were other miracles as well. These were 3 that happened very shortly after they entered into the Promised Land. So it says here, though, in verse 11, they forgot his works and his wonders that he had shown them. How can you forget something like that? How can you forget walking through the Red Sea, with the water standing on either side, I don't know how many, 80, 100 feet on either side, there's massive walls of water, and you walked. How could you ever forget that? How could you ever forget God coming down on Mount Sinai and speaking the Ten Commandments? How can you forget any of these things? Well, they did. They did. Going on in verse 12, the New International said, He did miracles in the sight of their ancestors, that is, the ancestors of those who were in the promised land under the judges, under Joshua and then the judges. He did miracles in the sight of their ancestors in the land of Egypt, in the region of Zoan. Now, the ancestors of the Israelites in the promised land were the descendants of Jacob who were in bondage in Egypt. Zoan was called Tanis by the Greeks. You know, and if you go back to which one of the Indiana Jones movies, anyway, they talked about Tanis, and Tanis is where you had to get that stick and get the, where exactly is the ark located? Okay, that's Tanis. They had that in the wrong place in the movie, but that's okay. We were not going to quibble about where they did it, because Zoan is up in the eastern part of the delta of the Nile, not down toward the city of the kings and all that. But anyway, we're not here to give a critique on Indiana Jones today. Anyway, Zoan was a city called Tanis by the Greeks that, again, was located not too far and maybe even within the land of Goshen. The land of Goshen was the eastern part of the Nile Delta. All right, in verse 13, Tanakh goes on, He split the sea and took them through it. He made the waters stand like a wall. Now, the one relating this particular historical account reflects back only to the final act of their deliverance from Egyptian bondage, when God opened a dry pathway through the Red Sea to allow all of the Israelites to escape. Back in Exodus chapter 14, Exodus 14 and verse 21. Exodus 14:21. It says, Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the Eternal caused the sea to go back by a strong east wind all that night, and made the sea into dry land, and the waters were divided. So the children of Israel went into the midst of the sea on the dry ground, and the waters were a wall to them on their right hand and on their left. All right, back in Psalm 78, verse 14, Tanakh goes on, He led them with a cloud by day, and throughout the night by the light of fire. From the time they began their trek out of Egypt until they concluded their 40 years traveling through the wilderness, God continually, every day, every night, God continually made His presence known among them and guided them to the promised land. The entire 40 years. Back in Exodus chapter 13, hold your place and we'll go back to Exodus 13, verse 21. Exodus 13, verse 21. It says here, And the Eternal went before them by day in a pillar of cloud to lead the way. He guided them. He led the way. And by night, He was in a pillar of fire to give them light, so as to go by day and night. Because when they were fleeing from Pharaoh, when they were leaving Egypt, they fled and went to Sukkot, the first night, because they hadn't slept the night before. And so then they made, from that point on, they were walking mostly day and night in order to get where they were going. They would have to take, short stops for rest, but basically God, I think, helped keep their stamina up so they could make that trek. It was a long way to go, well over 100 miles. It says he did not take away the pillar of cloud by day or the pillar of fire by night from before the people. So that was then, but it wasn't just then. It wasn't just as they were fleeing Egypt. In Deuteronomy chapter 1 and verse 32. Deuteronomy 1, verse 32, Yet Moses, again, going back and reiterating what they had experienced over 40 years, he says, "Yet for all that, you did not believe the eternal your God, who went in the way before you to search out a place for you to pitch your tents, to show you the way you should go, in the fire by night and in the cloud by day." And then we can go to Nehemiah, over here after Ezra and before Job, or Esther. Nehemiah chapter 9 and verse 19. And we have here the Tanakh translation. "You," speaking, the prayer here was to God that was being made, "you in your abundant compassion did not abandon them in the wilderness." This is, again, a review of what had happened to their ancestors. "The pillar of cloud did not depart from them to lead them on the way by day, nor the pillar of fire by night to give them light in the way they were to go." So for the entire 40 years, God guided them. He gave them instruction. He showed them by His presence. He was always present in a cloud of fire at night, or a pillar of cloud by day. God's spiritual nation, the elect, those who are of the final era of the church at the close of the age, must never forget that just as God was continually present with the carnal nation of Israel, so He is continually present with them. He's present with His elect at this particular time. The differences are that instead of dwelling visibly among them, He dwells in them by His Spirit. That's the difference of His presence. Not among them, but dwells literally in them by His Spirit. And rather than physically leading them by fire and a cloud, He guides their minds through the power of His Spirit, as the Apostle Paul brings out back in Romans 8, verses 9 or 9, 10 through 14, where he talks about all of that. All right, going on in Psalm 78, verse 15, the New Revised Standard. "He split rocks open in the wilderness and gave them drink abundantly as from the deep." Okay, so massive amounts of water came from this split rocks. Back in Exodus chapter 17, Exodus 17 and verse 5. Exodus 17:5 from the Tanakh translation. "Then the Eternal said to Moses, 'Pass before the people.'" Again, this event, He gave them drink abundantly. This event took place in Rephidim, about 2 weeks after God gave them manna. Okay, that's when this occurs. "The Eternal said to Moses, 'Pass before the people, take with you some of the elders of Israel, and take along the rod with which you struck the Nile, and set out. I will be standing there before you on the rock at Horeb. Strike the rock, and water will issue from it, and the people will drink.' And Moses did so in the sight of the elders of Israel. The place was named Massah and Meribah, because the Israelites quarreled, and because they tried the Eternal, saying, 'Is the Eternal present among us or not? If He's present, why doesn't He give us any water to drink?'" Okay. All right. So that, and apparently Rephidim is where, there's a gigantic rock that's got this perfect line through it, like it just came apart. And there's all kinds of erosion all around it there in Saudi Arabia, which is probably the very place where that event happened. Psalm 78, verse 16. "He also brought streams out of the rock and caused waters to run down like rivers." Now, this is referring to God providing water at Kadesh toward the end of the 40 years wandering. Rephidim was toward the beginning, and Kadesh was toward the close of the 40 years. Here in Numbers chapter 20, Numbers 20 and verse 8, God tells Moses here, take the rod, just like he did, 39 years, whatever it was before, 40 years before. Take the rod, you and your brother Aaron, gather the congregation together, speak to the rock. This time God is specific. You don't have to hit the rock like you did 40 years earlier. You just talk to the rock, and it will yield its water. You just tell it, and it's going to come out. Thus you shall bring water for them out of the rock, and give drink to the congregation and their animals. And we won't get into the fact that Moses was so irritated after all these years, 40 years of putting up with the insanity of these people. I mean, if I had to go through 40 years with having to listen to some of this stuff from major stream media and these Democrat judges and whatever, I'd go insane. I mean, because none of it is common sense. And the people, they got God there all the time. I mean, he's there at night in a pillar of fire. He's there in the day in a pillar of cloud. How in the world can you gripe and complain when God is with you all the time? But, well, it's because he's there all the time. Familiarity breeds contempt, and that's exactly the way it was with those people. Anyway, Moses hit the rock. He shouldn't have kept him out of the promised land, but he wasn't supposed to go into the promised land. Remember, he was to draw them out. Moses to draw out. Joshua, Savior, was to take them in. So, anyway, whatever. All right, let's move on to verse 17 of Psalm 78. It says, but they sinned even more against him by rebelling against the Most High in the wilderness. They rebelled, despite the great miracles God did in bringing them out of Egypt, in making his presence known among them every day and every night, and providing them water to drink in the desert areas where they dwelt. They showed him no gratitude. Instead, they constantly complained. They always found something to complain about. Verse 18 goes on, the Tanakh translation, to test God was in their mind. I think the New English translation is a little better here. They willfully challenged God. That's what they did. That's the reality. They challenged God. When they demanded food for themselves, or as the complete Jewish Bible has, when they demanded food that would satisfy their cravings. So they willfully challenged God when they demanded food that would satisfy their cravings. This section, beginning with this verse, verse 18, is a compilation of two separate events. The provision of manna 3 weeks before God spoke the Ten Commandments from Mount Sinai is one of the events, and the other about a year later, when they complained about having nothing but manna to eat. So they complained, and God gave them manna. Now, a year later, they're complaining because that's all he's given us. Verse 19, yes, they spoke against God. They said, can God prepare a table? Or some other translations, can God give us food in the wilderness? Can God give us food in the wilderness? Now, this complaint about their hunger would apply to both events, the one early on. Let's go back to Exodus 16, at the time when God gave them manna. Exodus 16 and verse 1. It says, and they journeyed from Elim, and all the congregation of the children of Israel came to the wilderness of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai, on the 15th day of the 2nd month after they departed from the land of Egypt. Okay, we're basically 4 weeks out. Then the whole congregation of the children of Israel complained against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. And the children of Israel said to them, "Oh, that we had died by the hand of the Eternal in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the pots of meat and when we ate bread to the full. If he'd have just struck us dead after we had a good full meal, it would have been better than what we're going through right now." This is the mentality. It sounds like some of the judges in the world today. Anyway, it goes on. "For you have brought us out into this wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger." Now, this was, again, God would give them manna. But let's go to Numbers chapter 11 for the other event that occurred about a year later. Numbers 11 and verse 4. "Now the mixed multitude who were among them," that is, among the tribes of Israel, "yielded to intense craving. So the children of Israel also wept again and said, 'Who will give us meat to eat? We remember the fish which we ate freely in Egypt.'" There was plenty of fish for us there. And then, to go along with it, we had cucumbers and melons and leeks and onions and garlic, things to really make it taste wonderful. "But now, for this past year, our whole being is dried up. There is nothing at all except this manna before our eyes." That's all we got, is this manna. Now, they lived on it for a whole year. And yet, how grateful were they for that? Not at all. Hold your place there, we're going to come back. But let's go back to Psalm 78, verse 20. Psalm 78:20, Tanakh translates, "True." This was what they would say. "True, he struck the rock and waters flowed. Streams gushed forth. But can he provide bread," or better, food, as a lot of other translations have? Can he provide food? Can he supply his people with meat, flesh? Can he do that? Yeah, well, water's one thing, but flesh, that's something else. God had actually provided manna before providing them any water from the rock, if you go back, as far as the time frame of things. So this verse 20, can only be linked to the event in Numbers where the people craved the flesh of animals to eat, because it was only then. This was well after the water had been supplied from a rock. So let's go back to Numbers 11. Well, no, I tell you what, we need to get verse 21 here before we do that. Psalm 78, verse 21. Go on in the Tanakh translation. "The Eternal heard." He heard this. Can he provide his people with meat? God heard. "And he raged." He was furious. "Fire broke out against Jacob. Anger flared up at Israel." New Living Translation goes on in verse 22, "For they did not believe God or trust him to care for them." Or as the New King James says, "nor trust in his salvation." They didn't trust that he was saving them. They didn't trust that he cared for them. Now this refers to what God, now let's turn over to Numbers 11. This refers to what God did to many of them 3 days after they left Mount Sinai. What is mentioned there in verses 21 and 22 of Psalm 78. Refers to what he did 3 days after they left Mount Sinai, after being there for about a year, because of their complaining. Despite all that God had done in delivering them from bondage and providing them all of their needs, they still complained. So here in Numbers 11, verse 1, "Now when the people complained, it displeased the Eternal. For the Eternal heard it, and his anger was aroused. So the fire of the Eternal burned among them and consumed some in the outskirts of the camp. Then the people cried out to Moses, and when Moses prayed to the Eternal, the fire was quenched. So he called the name of the place Taberah, which simply means burning, because the fire of the Eternal had burned among them." All right, so this precedes what goes on here about the complaining and what happened because of the complaining. Again, verse 22, for they did not believe, back here in Psalm 78, for they did not believe God or trust him to care for them, though, verse 23 going on in the King James translation, though he had commanded the clouds from above, or the skies above, some other translations have, and opened the doors of heaven, and had rained down manna upon them to eat, and had given them of the corn, or grain, or bread, different translations have here, of heaven, the grain or the bread of heaven. On the day after the fourth Sabbath from the Exodus out of Egypt through the Red Sea, God began giving Israel manna to eat. Let's go back to Exodus 16. Exodus 16, and we'll go first of all to verse 4, which gives us the account of what happened then, of what verses 23 and 24 are talking about. Okay, verse 4, Tanakh translates, and the Eternal said to Moses, Exodus 16:4, I will rain down bread for you from the sky, and the people shall go out and gather each day that day's portion, that I may thus test them to see whether they will follow my instructions or not. Now, let's skip down to verse 12. I have heard the grumbling of the Israelites. Speak to them and say, by evening you shall eat flesh, and in the morning you shall have your fill of bread, and you shall know that I, the Eternal, am your God. In the evening quail appeared and covered the camp. In the morning there was a fall of dew about the camp. When the fall of dew lifted, there, over the surface of the wilderness, lay a fine and flaky substance, as fine as frost on the ground. When the Israelites saw it, they said to one another, what is it? Or, as the King James has, they said, it is manna. For they did not know what it was, because that's what manna means. Don't know what it is. But so that's the reason we call it manna, is because of King James. For they didn't know what it was. And Moses said to them, that is the bread which the Eternal has given you to eat. Remember what I told you last night? What I told you yesterday? That's the bread. That's it. You got to go out there and harvest it. Now, hold your place there. We'll go back to Psalm 78 and verse 25. And we're told here, New Revised Standard translation, mortals ate of the bread of angels. Or the New English translation simply has, mortals ate of the food, or ate the food of the mighty ones. Because Elohim can be angels or it can be mighty ones, either one there. The people who composed God's nation were given the perfect food for sustaining physical life. You know, had all of the essential amino acids in it. Had every mineral, every vitamin, everything that you could want. Everything your body needed to sustain physical life. It was very rich and very delicious. Once it was prepared and cooked, it came out sounding really, really good. Notice in Numbers chapter 11 again. Numbers 11 and verse 7. Now, the manna was like coriander seed, something about almost a quarter inch, in diameter, about that size. It was like coriander seed, and its color like the color of bdellium, or as the Complete Jewish Bible brings out, it was white like gum resin. You might see, we had gum trees in the South. You don't have them up here. You don't want them up here. You drop stuff on the ground. Anyway, or you can look at sometimes pine trees and you'll see that, there'll be a sap, resin come out, and it'll turn whitish, kind of a crystal color. The sun hits it a certain way, kind of a crystalline white. And I think that's the color, basically, of bdellium. It says, the people went about and gathered it, ground it on millstones or beat it in the mortar, cooked it in pans and made cakes of it. And its taste, okay, how did it taste? It was like the taste of pastry prepared with oil. Or the Revised English Bible, it tasted like butter cakes. Now, why would anybody complain about that? Well, they did. But that's what it tasted like. Now, back in Psalm 78, mortals ate the bread of angels. He sent them food in abundance. God wasn't skimpy with what he gave them. Let's go back to Exodus chapter 16 again and verse 16. Exodus 16:16, because we find here that everyone's appetite was satisfied every day. Not at no point in time did anybody get hungry. It was always there. Here in verse 16 of Exodus 16, this is what the Eternal has commanded. Gather as much of it as each of you requires to eat. An omer to a person, for as many of you as there are. Each of you shall fetch for those in his tent. So one individual, one representative for each household, each tent, went out to collect for that individual and everyone that shared the tent. The Israelites did so, some gathering much, some little. But when they measured it by the omer, he who had gathered much had no excess, there was no extra, and he who had gathered little had no deficiency. It still came up to 1 omer. They had gathered as much as they needed to eat, or as the Revised English Bible, as much as they could eat. About a half a gallon a day is how much they got. That would be an omer, about a half a gallon. Now, back in Psalm 78 and verse 26. After getting this background here, he caused an east wind to blow in the heavens, and by his power he brought in the south wind. He also rained meat on them like the dust, or like a dust storm, several translations have. Feathered fowl, or winged birds, as Tanakh has, like the sand of the seas. There's no way to count them, there are so many. Verse 28 in the Revised English Bible, he made them fall within the camp all around their tents. Verse 29 from the New Living Translation, the people ate their fill. He gave them what they craved. After rehearsing the background of God's provision of manna for his people, the historical account now continues here in verses 26 all the way down here to verse 31 by showing God's response to the people's ingratitude for the manna and their obsession with preferring the flesh of animals to the bread from heaven. Let's go back to Numbers chapter 6, where we have details of this. Numbers 11 and verse 31. Numbers 11, verse 31. I'll read from the Tanakh translation again. It says, a wind from the Eternal started up, swept quail from the sea, and strewed them over the camp, about a day's journey on this side and about a day's journey on that side, all around the camp. And some 2 cubits, or translated to what we understand, the complete Jewish Bible has, and some 3 feet deep on the ground. Okay? 3 feet deep these quail are on the ground. The people set to gathering quail all that day and that night and all the next day. Even he who gathered least had 10 omers, or homers, spelling it out, which is equivalent to 50 bushels, according to the New Living Translation. 50 bushels. So the one who gathered the least had 50 bushels. That is a whale of a lot of bushels. You know about how big a bushel basket is. I mean, that's a lot. And they spread them out all around the camp. That is, they spread them out to dry because they didn't have refrigeration, so you had to dry them. And that's what they were doing. They were going to save that meat because they were going to eat those things for a whole month, for 30 days. They're going to eat these things. Okay, hold your place there. And once again, Psalm 78. 78 verse 30. New Living Translation. But before they satisfied their craving, while the meat was yet in their mouths, they'd taken the first bite, the anger of God rose against them, and he killed their strongest men. He struck down the finest of Israel's young men. All right, let's go back to Numbers 11 and pick this up here in verse 33. Numbers 11:33. But while the meat was still between their teeth, before it was chewed, the wrath of the Eternal was aroused against the people, and the Eternal struck the people with a very great plague. Now, this display of God's anger emphasizes that God is never pleased with those who disrespect him and treat lightly his gifts. This is especially applicable to his elect concerning the true manna that he has provided for their spiritual nourishment and spiritual growth, which makes eternal life possible for each of them. Without that growth, no eternal life. So there's got to be growth. There's got to be, the true manna has got to be taken in. Otherwise, the transformation of mind can't take place. The spiritual changes can't take place. Back in John chapter 6, let's go back and read what Jesus said about this manna, about what it represented. And it's important to each one of us. Here in John 6, verse 32, breaking into verse 32, he says, "My Father gives you the true," or the genuine, the Complete Jewish Bible has, gives you the true bread from heaven. This is the genuine stuff. This is the spiritual. For the bread of God is he who comes down from heaven and gives life to the world. That's the bread of God. Who is he that comes down? Well, Christ is the only one that's come down and gives life to the world. Then they said to him, "Lord, give us this bread always," or from now on, as the Complete Jewish Bible brings out better. That's what these people, remember, they've been fed the day before. It came all the way back across the Sea of Galilee, and now they want to be fed again. "Lord, give us this bread from now on." And Jesus said to them, "I am the bread of life. He who comes to me shall never hunger, and he who believes on me shall never thirst." Now, let's skip down to verse 47. "Most assuredly, I say to you, he who believes on me has everlasting," or some translations have eternal, has everlasting or eternal life. He who believes on me. I am the bread of life. I'm the one. If you want to live, you got to eat this bread. That's what bread of life means. You want life, you got to eat the bread. Your fathers ate the manna in the wilderness and are dead. Or verse 50 goes on, "This is the bread which comes down from heaven, that one may eat of it and not die." That manna provided only spiritual or physical nourishment. This manna provides the spiritual nourishment, which Israel did not get from that manna that they collected out there that came like the frost across the wilderness. I am the living bread which came down from heaven. If anyone eats of this bread, he will live forever. And the bread that I shall give is my flesh, which I shall give for the life of the world. Now, skipping verse 52 to verse 53, "Then Jesus said to them, Most assuredly, I say to you, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood," of course we know symbols of the Passover, "you have no life in you. Whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood has eternal life, and I will raise him up at the last day. For my flesh is food indeed, and my blood is drink indeed. He who eats my flesh and drinks my blood abides in me, and I in him. Or as Goodspeed says, he who eats my flesh and drinks my blood remains united to me, and I remain united to him. As the living Father sent me, and I live because of the Father, so he who feeds on me, or lives on me, lives by eating me, by taking me in as the genuine manna, will live because of me. This is the bread which came down from heaven, not as your fathers ate the manna, that physical, and are dead. He who eats this bread, which is spiritual, will live forever. Now God has revealed in Revelation chapter 3 that many of his elect at the close of this age will be guilty of not being grateful for the true manna. He's revealed that. The Father has provided it, but they're not grateful. Instead of seeing their constant need for the presence and strength of the Savior in their lives, they will deceive themselves into thinking that they are spiritually rich. So rich, in fact, that they have need of nothing else. Remember Revelation 3:17. You say that you're rich and you're wealthy, you have need of nothing, and yet you are blind, you're naked, you're poor, you're miserable. You don't see it. But they, again, deceive themselves into thinking that they have need of nothing, including not needing the daily portion of the bread from heaven for which we each must ask. Ask for your daily bread. Matthew chapter 6, again. Outline prayer, outline of prayer. We must ask daily for our daily bread. And he is that daily bread. He is the manna that we need, just like Israel every day had the physical manna. Every day we need the spiritual manna. We need that nourishment. We need to take in the true manna. All right, back in Psalm 78 again. Psalm 78, verse 32, New Living Translation has, but in spite of in spite of God striking a bunch of people dead because of their lust for the flesh and because they detested the manna, but in spite of this, the people kept sinning. Despite his wonders, they refused to trust him. Regardless of having seen the many, many things that God had done, the miracles that he had performed on their behalf, and despite having witnessed the devastation that befalls those who provoke God to anger, such as those who were killed because of eating that quail so quickly, because of all of that, God, they couldn't do it. They had to be unfaithful to him. They simply could not get their heads on as they needed to be. They were disloyal to God. They were unfaithful to his covenant. Shortly after God destroyed the ones who incited the people to be ungrateful for the gift of manna, he instructed Moses. Let's go back to Numbers chapter 14. Numbers chapter 14. He instructed Moses to send 12 men to spy out the land of Canaan in preparation for taking possession of the promised land. Even though Joshua and Caleb were confident that God would assure their success in gaining control of the land, the other 10 were faithless. And they gave a very bad and evil report, which turned all of the people against Joshua, against Caleb, and ultimately against God. Here in verse 1 of chapter 14 of Numbers, I'll read from the New Living Translation. Then the whole community began weeping aloud, and they cried all night. Their voices rose in a great chorus of protest against Moses and Aaron. If only we had died in Egypt, or even here in the wilderness, they complained. Why is the Eternal taking us to this country only to have us die in battle? Why is he doing this? Our wives and our little ones will be carried off as plunder. Wouldn't it be better for us to return to Egypt? Then they plotted among themselves, let's choose a new leader and go back to Egypt. This is despite having seen what God did. They just simply, they seemed to be blind, but God was there, pillar of fire by day or by night, pillar of cloud by day. He's there among them the whole time. Now at this point, God was again ready to destroy Israel for their faithlessness. He was prepared to do it early on, and he's prepared to do it again here. Let's go down to verse 11 of Numbers 14. It says, Then the Eternal said to Moses, How long will these people reject me? And how long will they not believe me? With all the signs which I have performed among them, I will strike them with the pestilence and disinherit them, and I will make of you a nation greater and mightier than they. Now, this did not appeal to Moses' ego. Just didn't. Now, maybe 39 years later, when he hit the rock, he may have been pretty perturbed then. But, at this point, that wasn't the case. Nope. Moses pleaded to God for his mercy toward the Israelites at this point. Going on here in verse 13. And Moses said to the Eternal, Then the Egyptians will hear it. You do this, the Egyptians are going to hear it. For by your might you brought these people up from among them. The Egyptians can attest to the plagues, what you did to destroy Egypt, to destroy their army that went into the Red Sea. They know about you, and yet they know how strong, how mighty you are. And they will tell it to the inhabitants of this land. They have heard that you, Eternal, are among these people, that you, Eternal, are seen face to face, and your cloud stands above them, and you go before them in a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. Now, if you kill these people as one man, then the nations which have heard of your fame will speak, saying, Because the Eternal was not able to bring this people to the land which he swore to give them, therefore he killed them in the wilderness. And now I pray, let the power of my Lord be great, just as you have spoken, saying, The Eternal is long-suffering and abundance. Remember, that's what he told him back there, in Exodus 30, 31, 32, when he passed by and spoke his name and what it all meant. The Eternal is long-suffering and abundant in mercy, forgiving iniquity and transgression. But he by no means clears the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the third and fourth generation. Pardon, verse 19. Notice what Moses appeals to God to do. Pardon the iniquity of this people, I pray, according to the greatness of your mercy, just as you have forgiven this people from Egypt even until now. You've forgiven them time and time and time again. Please do it this one more time. Well, hold your place there. Last verse that we're going to cover today in Psalm 78, verse 33. I'll read from the Revised English Bible. So, he made their days end in emptiness, or futility, as the New King James has, and their years in terror. Their days ended in futility, their years ended in terror. In accordance with Moses' plea, God did not destroy Israel. But he did decree that none of those who were unfaithful would be allowed to enter into the promised land. So let's pick this up in verse 20 of Numbers 14. Numbers 14, verse 20. Then the Eternal said, I have pardoned according to your word. But truly, as I live, all the earth shall be filled with the glory of the eternal. That is, eventually, this is going to be the case, and all will know. Because all these men who have seen my glory, they are the first to have seen it. I've let them see it, what it's going to be for all nations ultimately. They have seen my glory and the signs which I did in Egypt and in the wilderness, and have put me to the test now these 10 times, or these many times, as Tanakh brings out, and have not heeded my voice. Because of this, they were the first fruits. They are the first ones that we're going to get to see. They were the ones who've seen my glory from the mountaintop. They've heard my voice. They certainly shall not see the land which I swore to their fathers, nor shall any of those who rejected me see it. But my servant Caleb, because he has a different spirit in him and has followed me fully, I will bring into the land where he went, and his descendant shall inherit it. Now, besides Caleb, the only ones who would be allowed to live on, and then to enter into the promised land, the land that was promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, would be Joshua and all of the Israelites who were under 20 years of age at the time of the Exodus out of Egypt. They're the only ones. All the rest would live out the remainder of their lives, which would be a maximum, for some of them, of a little over 38 years from this point in Numbers 14. That's all the time they would have left. In futility, because they had no hope. They had no hope of achieving the blessing of life in the promised land. And of course, we can see there's some parallels here. For spiritual Israel, there is responsibility to be exceedingly grateful to God and appreciative of what we have been given in understanding and insight. So that's all for the first 33 verses, and we'll hopefully finish the rest of it next time.